There is no alacrity rune, power or condi, by the way. It doesn't exist. And there's no alacrity power rune either, or a quickness power rune.
Hey, you know, there's 9 or so runes that we could add to the game.
That's true.
Based on the based on the names of new elite specs, perhaps.
There's a lot of options there. You know, you can make a rune just for Catalyst.
Yeah. Oh,
the 6-boat. The 6-boat. Yeah, minus 10% damage. It's the opposite of Scholar. It's like literally negative 10% damage is the 6 bonus on Rune of the Catalyst. We are live. I think I got the audio right first try as well. I believe I did. In fact,
1, 2.
Yeah. I think that actually worked. Nice. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
To a special edition of TeaTime, where old enemies can become friends once again. Me and Boots, we've got over our beef, and it was brutal. You know, like it's been a long time since he's been on TeaTime. It was savage. It really was. You know, the toxicity was unbound. You know, we didn't even put it in public. It was too much. We both would have been removed from all social media platforms for the vitriol we were throwing at each other. But anyway, he's back now. And we're here to talk about the Balance Manifesto. The Guild Wars 2 Balance Manifesto. The philosophy explained by CMC and Roy in a very charismatic manner just the other day. And of course, I'm also joined by Emmy, a huge intellect. Will help shed some light on what the hell's going on. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the show. And of course, welcome, chat. It's been a little while since there's been the TeaTime, but we now returned. So let's go ahead and leap on right into it. And the stream revealed a lot of interesting things, in my opinion. In fact, the big takeaway, one of the big takeaways I have, is that I was surprised at how far ArenaNet actually went here. They said a lot of very strong statements, but also quite measurable statements as well. They were talking about how builds need to have strengths and weaknesses. You know, a build can't do everything. They called it holes in roles. Pretty funny. They were talking about the idea of making good and bad choices, the idea of actual roles, acknowledging the reality of the way people actually engage with the game. You know, essentially it's kind of like downstream talking about like how people make groups and how people use the looking for group system, right? And how all of that is affected by the balance and by the skill design of the game. So I was really impressed that they were willing to go that far in expressing some of these ideas, in fact, because whenever you do a stream like this, and in fact, I think quite a lot of people probably would have cautioned ArenaNet against doing a stream like this because, well, I'm sure you all remember the manifesto from the start of the game, the original Guild Wars 2, you know, Colin Johansson, I swing my sword, I swing it again manifesto. Yeah, ArenaNet are still being held to that today, right? So this philosophy that ArenaNet have put out here, they will be held to it until the end of time. And they were very cautious on saying it's a living document. We're going to update it. And, you know, it's not finished. It doesn't necessarily reflect the state of the game.
Trying to do.
Here's what we're trying to do. But yeah, let's open it up with some general thoughts. What do we think of it? I was really impressed personally, actually. And I really enjoyed the stream at that high level overview of the approach to skill design that Guild Wars 2 have. But what do you think? Am I completely insane? Am I totally wrong? Let me know.
I think one of the things I really like is that they actually took the time to define a lot of the terms that they were using, because I think historically when they've said things and they've kind of hand waved it away, the community interpreted in the way that they wanted to interpret it. So I think like the best example of this was back when they said every player should be able to play as they like, right? It's like what they meant is that they have a variety of different builds that you can choose from to fit a specific playstyle that you want. But what everybody else kind of interpreted that as was, yeah, I can play whatever weird mishmash of skills I have, and I should be able to complete everything in the game. And I think I think in part, I don't think there's really anyone at fault for this, right? Because if they didn't take the time to explain that, then of course people are going to interpret it in a wildly different way than maybe what they intended. But since they actually took the time to kind of like set, I think, the groundwork for future streams, and I think this is also really important. It's like, this is not the final live stream that we're going to get. They're going to continue to expand on this. They're going to continue to like talk about like, you know, like the living document and everything. And because of that, we can like kind of view the stuff that they've said as non-permanent. I think the big reason why people like see like balance balance changes as permanent is because historically they have been, right? It's like they introduce a change, then they don't touch it for 6 months, a year, sometimes like 2 years or more, right? So it's like I think we've gotten more communication in the past 3 months than the past 3 years combined. So I think it's pretty safe to say that, like, a lot of these changes, like they're actually going to be following up on them. And even if they don't, they have more chances to do so.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting stream because it makes you think. You kind of wonder who it was for. So like if you're us, the three of us on stream, for example, right now, I don't think it was specifically for us because all the things that they were talking about were things that sort of we understood already about what they're trying to do in the game, just based on little tidbits of what they say throughout all different streams. And when they're doing the balance patch, they give little notes about what they're saying as well. And so we sort of inferred it from all the stuff previously, if that's what their current design approach is. But you're right. The fact that they're defining the terms that they're using, they're getting more in depth in what their intents are, intention is for people. I think that's good for the majority of the player base to know, not just us, right? Like, I'm pretty sure there's a large proportion of the player base who has learned a lot from this stream, unlike some people who think that it was too short or something or didn't go too far in depth. But yeah, I think it was good.
I think that, yeah, certainly in the player base, there's a really big concern that balance isn't done in a reasonable way. I think that, look, let's just leap into it. Let's just get in there. Here's the problem. I think a lot of people, especially with some leaked Discord DMs, or rather public messages, actually, not Discord, not direct messages, they thought there was a lot of bias going into a lot of balance changes. Like, oh, like maybe we just like Firebrand. Maybe I just really like Mechanist and we don't like Catalyst. All right. And, that's the way we're going to balance the game now. Enjoy. That's just the way it is. A few comments certainly really, really upset people, about that, and a few kind of inferred ideas with the way changes have been being made and the state of the game, play rates, looking at stuff like, Guild Wars 2 Wingman, looking at the fact that at one point, and it never got there, I'm almost sad it didn't make it. I'm actually sad about this. This is actually true. Mech plus Firebrand at one point got to 47% on Wingman. Just those two elite specs. If you kind of go, okay, right, we're going to put Guardian and Engie, that was over 50% on Wingman. Now, to be clear, actually, this was actually commented on a little bit by ArenaNet, and they said that those numbers are actually overinflated. The actual overall play rate wasn't that insane. It wasn't that crazy, and more specifically, actually, Firebrand dominated harder than Mech even. That's kind of interesting, right? But that type of thing really sways public perception. And I think this, the philosophy and the manifesto here that ArenaNet put out, I think that actually does kind of relax that and calm that a little bit, because they essentially just say, yeah, these are the, they essentially admitted that they are aware of the issues, or not even admitted, right? They confirm that they're aware of it and that they do want to actually address this to increase diversity in the way people approach the game and make sure that a lot of different strategies and compositions are indeed perfectly viable and perfectly acceptable with some decent play rates there as well. But yeah, so I think
it's interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's interesting. I think that mentality too, that people who infer that it's all Firebrands and Mechanists, it's kind of a spiral as well. It's kind of like a doom spiral, because when the majority of the player base think that the only thing that's acceptable these days is Firebrand and Mechanist, they'll play Firebrand and Mechanist to be accepted into groups, and then it's just a doom spiral, because then that's all there is in groups anymore. But yeah, you're right. They the holes in roles is one of the things that they have to address, and that's one of the things that's the issue with Firebrand and Mechanist right now, is that they don't have very many holes in their roles.
Yeah, it's true.
Trade-off for how much they bring to the table. I mean, they kind of indirectly mentioned it directly in the stream, but like one skill was very, very overloaded, and it had like basically 5 skills and a single skill. So take into account that, like, I mean, Mechanist and Firebrand are some of the few classes in the game where you have more than just your 10 core skills from like your weapons, utilities, and elite and heal and all that kind of stuff. So overloading even one of those skills then expands on that even more. Whereas like, I guess like other classes, like, I don't know, I guess just warrior, for example, right? It's like you have your like 1 or 2 F1 skills, and that's like pretty much it. You don't have tomes to dip into. You don't have a pet to follow you around. You don't have like kits to like dip in and out of. So,
Yeah. It's very
They did mention this again.
flexible.
They did mention this a little bit too within the stream, and I think this does speak to how long it's going to take to address some of these issues. But a lot of this stuff can only be fixed by design, right? They can't just play with the numbers, and these problems are going to go away. It's like that I've talked about a lot. Okay, everyone can just tell me how right I am now. But Firebrand, it turns out that if you replace 3 skills on Core Guardian with 15 skills, that's pretty good. That's pretty powerful. That's a pretty strong thing to have on your elite specialization. Not too bad, not too bad. And that stuff needs to be tackled with design changes, either by toning down that design or by improving and empowering the design of other specializations in the game. I think I'd kind of like to see a little bit of both, right? Because I think there is something to be said for builds that are very versatile. They're actually really fun to play. They're really engaging, but they do have a tendency to be very, very dominant. In fact, if you look at the history of Guild Wars 2 Balance, the builds that actually do really, really well are the hybrid builds. And that's across all game modes, by the way. Stuff like Renegade and Hollowsmith, dominating PvP, just incredibly versatile builds. No matter where you are, you're delivering value. In PvE, you're looking at your Firebrands, your Scourges, your Mechanists. Virtuoso now, by the way. I'm not letting the Mesmers get away with this, especially seeing as Emmy's here, okay? She's like, oh yeah, let's not talk about Virtuoso, we don't need to bring that up, but actually we have to bring that up, okay? We've got to, yeah.
But Virtuoso is strong not because of a holes and roll situation. Virtuoso is strong just because it's very good at what it's doing. There's one thing, which is the DPS right now and being able to survive doing DPS.
I think it's also
the utility is also very good.
Core
like
Mesmer.
the portals, the blink, mass invis, the boon rip is also very good on it. Okay, I should really stop talking.
Exactly. You're digging a hole there. Yeah.
I was trying to protect you there.
Yeah.
No, actually, that was like 10 patches ago. It's not relevant anymore.
Oh yeah, it's irrelevant. Yeah. Think about holes and rolls though. It's interesting. So like if they Firebrand and Mechanist, very good because they don't have very many holes in the rolls, and also they each have kits. Basically, kits are extremely useful. The tomes are basically kits for Firebrand, but not quite as good as normal kits. So if you, let's say, with a Firebrand or a Mechanist, remove something from them to give them a hole, like Mechanist, maybe their F ability doesn't give stability anymore or something, or doesn't give protection anymore. That's kind of a bit of a hole that's getting removed or getting put in. It's not just that simple, right? Because they need to design, once you start putting holes in each role, it's kind of creating a puzzle piece, right? And then you have to make sure that the other classes match those puzzle pieces so they fit together. And they have to make sure that there's multiple puzzle pieces that match that puzzle piece, so that it's not just Mechanist has to be with Firebrand, Mechanist has to be with Virtuoso or something like that. So it's actually pretty complicated what they're going to try to do here.
It is, yeah. And I think they must be very aware of this. The goal is to make sure that groups can still form easily, right? That's the other thing. Because if they make it too complicated, then in a way you're making the game harder. The game has now become more challenging, and that's probably somewhat undesirable. I mean, it's okay for the game itself to be harder, but you kind of don't want actually getting to the content to be harder as such, right? And that can definitely happen if things do get overly complicated and out of control in that regard, and you have to have all these pieces, you got to smush them together, right? I think it's much better to have kind of what we have right now, which is almost like having the way it is right now is that quickness providers and alacrity providers kind of slot together quite nicely. So you can usually combine one with the other and it will usually work out pretty well. Funnily enough, I actually think that a really good way to smooth out the puzzle pieces here would be to actually give DPS builds more utility and some boons kind of thrown onto them as well. I think super selfish glass cannon builds. I think that's fine to exist. You got your blade sworn in there. Hell, Weaver down the line at some point, right? Something like that. I think that's totally fine. But I think that stuff like Vindicator is really cool because it can give stability with Chalice, right? You could, again, something like a Mesmer that can take some condition cleanse, that can take stability with the mantra. Soul Beast can take some stance sharing, all that kind of stuff. I think that throwing a bit of utility to these damage classes, I think, will really smooth out the group building process and kind of compensate for the added holes that are going to be used to balance the game.
Yeah. And that seems. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, please, go.
I'll go ahead first then. So I think I agree with that. I think DPS having utility like kind of on demand is really good. Like the example that I always used back in the day with when Chrono was really popular is you could take Gravwell and it was this massive CC that could help in a lot of situations, right? I think one of the important things is I don't think we should add more, I guess, like quickness and alacrity, like splashes of them, because I think that overcomplicates this kind of like offensive support role system that we already have going. Because then you might have some people who are like, yeah, I'm bringing this Chrono that brings up 50% alacrity uptime. You probably want someone else that's doing the same. And I think that would complicate it more. But like things like Aegis, stability, CC is like another form of utility. Even just things like, I don't know, like movement, right? So like movement skills so that you can like handle mechanics and stuff. That's all kind of like in that branch of utility.
And I feel like that extra utility is what they were talking about later on in the in the skill splits. Where was it? They're in what they're trying to design. They're trying to design classes that at least one easy to play class for each easy to play build for each class, but then if you have a mastery of the mechanics, can add more value. So I feel like the mastery of the mechanics would add those utility values to a group. So I feel like people who just want to have a low intensity, have a low difficulty build maybe doesn't have to bring that utility. I think that's still fine, but have that as an option if you have mastery of the mechanics.
Yeah, for sure.
I really liked they mentioned in the balance preview like they want every class to have access to some sort of low intensity build that's like very effective, like the same way that Mechanist is like for the engineer class. I think that's actually really good. I know there's like been a lot of I think there hasn't been that much, but there have been some vocal minority people saying like, low intensity kind of like trivializes like the difficulty of some other classes, cuff elementalists. I think having the existence of low intensity builds is actually good because it drives more players towards the types of content that we want to see, right? Which is like end game content or highly competitive content and that sort of thing. But I think it's kind of like you said, I think just raw numbers is not going to be enough to fix that, right? It's like you can buff core LE staff fire one skill to like do 30,000 damage per auto attack, but that's not really going to fix the problem, right? So it's like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that creating a lower barrier to entry to a lot of this content is actually incredibly desirable. Look, I'm just going to double down here. I'm going to kind of defend Power Mech here a little bit. Builds that are similar to Power Mech, but not quite as overtuned, obviously, I actually think are really good for the game because it allows players to actually engage with the content, just like Emmy said. And in a way, I kind of view players getting stuck on not being able to do a rotation as kind of like a triviality, really. It's like, if you're getting gatekept by that, that's kind of lame, right? Really, that's not a super good thing. I don't think that doing rotations is actually a very skill testing thing in Guild Wars 2 at all. I think that the way you use your abilities and respond to the environment is significantly more skillful. So I don't really have a problem with defocusing rotations, at least obviously for the entry level. When you kind of get to performance raiding and you get to speed running or challenge mode, then I think it's absolutely fine to emphasize, execution, right? And executing your rotation perfectly to really get additional value and accelerate your team through the encounter, or of course, reach a strict DPS check. I think that is perfectly valid. But on the entry level, I just don't think it's super interesting, really. Especially considering, by the way, that damage checks in Guild Wars 2 are extremely low, right? If you actually crunch the numbers on stuff like Veil Guardian, you do not need a lot of damage, right? To get through that, really, to be honest. It's not really that interesting. It's not really a big deal. So yeah, I think it's a really, really good idea to actually reduce the barrier to entry on piloting certain builds so that players can actually just engage with the content. It works out well for everyone, right? The more people that can engage with the content, right? You know, hey, that's how you get Wing 8. It's all part of the plan.
That makes me think. That is part of the plan. I think maybe that's why it's taken a little longer than usual to nerf Firebrand, to nerf Mechanist to something that's a little bit less overpowered in certain circumstances. Because, I mean, part of the reason why they were doing strike missions is to get more people into 10-man content, to get more people playing that stuff. And if you give people tools to make it easier to get into that kind of thing, and don't take it away from them as soon as people start complaining, then they're going to get into that stuff. And maybe we're seeing a revival of strike missions stuff because of it.
Yeah. I would absolutely love to see this. And I think that pushing builds, this is going to sound like such a weird take, but I think pushing builds to be a little bit more Firebrandy, a little bit more Mechanisty sometimes is actually a good thing. Because again, if we look at the builds that perform really, really well in PvE, it isn't the glass cannons. You can slap like 45k DPS on Weaver if you want to, and honestly, that probably would be fine actually. But at the end of the day, that's not really going to give you value, right? Because if you look at the really high value specs, they're kind of moderate damage, but incredibly high utility. My favorite example of this is always going to be Scourge. Scourge, it's, you know, even when it had very low damage at around 30k, it was absolutely insane. It was incredible. One of the strongest builds, if not the strongest builds for Pug gameplay that existed in the game at the time. Those are the builds that do really, really well. So I'd like to see some builds that are more on the entry level that also kind of have a bit of that utility defensive punch, and you can have some really, like some really squishy, glassy, mega damage builds there as well for players who really want to push themselves to the limit and kind of minimize your support, rely on a few dedicated supports and maybe a bit of offensive buffing as well, and just go all out and blast things. I think that type of approach, honestly, could be incredible for the health of the game, actually, because it will just allow players to access the content and play through it and get the foot in the door.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had a little bit of a thought bubble here, so I promise it still relates to what you're saying, but it's a bit of a tangent. So I think I'm comparing Yours 2 right now to, I've been playing a little bit of Final Fantasy, and something that I felt very differently in both games is that Final Fantasy has a very clear progression of your class, right? It's like as you're leveling, you're unlocking certain skills at certain levels. And since they have these instance encounters pretty early on in the game, you kind of learn like what this specific skill does and under which circumstances you use it, right? Whereas I feel like with Yours 2, it's instead of there being like a hard progression system in the game, like obviously there's level 1 through 80, but I think most people acknowledge that's kind of like the glorified tutorial of the game. But once you hit level 80, your power is stagnant, right? Like the only thing you can do is get better gear and then learn your rotation like a little bit better, or not even just your rotation, but your skills a little bit better, right? So I feel like you kind of lack that gradual like progression in end game content. So then people don't really realize the impact that these skills have, right? So it's kind of like you said, Elementalist, you can do 45k DPS, you can do a lot of damage, but it doesn't bring that much utility to the table. I would actually argue, I think a lot of players don't even realize that. They don't realize that there's a difference between an Elementalist doing 45k pure glass cannon DPS and then a Scourge that's doing 35k DPS with a ton of utility, just because it's not introduced to them. So just the thought that I had.
And I think it's also quite you mentioned this before the show, actually. I think you're absolutely right. It's almost a bit more intangible to measure utility, to measure defensive stuff like that. It's like, how do you evaluate that? It's really hard to do, especially for a new player. And that can really skew the perception of balance as well, and the way that players interact with it. Is that a lot of the stuff that really makes builds super, super strong, it's kind of it's quite subtle sometimes why a build is so strong. Like, why is that ability so good? And that's why I think we see a lot of players look at damage, right? This build does this amount of DPS. This build has these boons and can produce this uptime, because those are very tangible and measurable. Whereas stuff like, well, Scourge has Sand Cascade that is like 3k barrier to a few targets. That's a little bit difficult to quantify the impact it has on the fight directly, right? When you play with it, you notice immediately what's going on there, especially when you take it away, right? Like, a really funny example is, like, imagine going into a raid, and it's, you know, with new players, right? And you go in with 6 Scourges versus 6 Weavers. That's going to be a very different experience, okay? If you do those two things, it's not going to be the same. But it might not be immediately obvious why, until you kind of dig into the weeds and pick apart what's actually going on there.
Yeah, for new players, it's interesting because until you reach endgame, the game is very solo oriented, right? Like pretty much it's all solo oriented. And I was discussing this on Lightbringers, I think, because we were talking about whether it's possible to bring in henchmen into the game somehow. And I was like, I don't think we need it. But in the core game, because of the fact that it's solo, there's no reason to play a healing spec. There's no reason to build and learn why healing's important. There's no reason to build and learn why support is important. Everything is basically you should be doing as much damage as possible until the end, right? Until you start learning about the game finally at endgame. And with henchmen, I guess you could learn about support if you're supporting your henchmen. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. It would be great if there was a way to teach players, new players, about the importance of support before they're thrown into the deep end, you know? But I don't know if it's possible.
I think a lot of that, it's kind of a separate conversation, but if they introduce more instance content early into the game, right? Like right now, dungeons are a thing, but they're kind of optional. Like you don't have to do them to progress the story. And I think also in a lot of ways, you technically don't have to do the story at all, right? And you can just continue to level to 80 just through pure exploration. So I think if there's like more incentive to like actually enter group content early on into the game, it's just more exposure early on. And I think, anyway, I guess like, we're talking about balance, but I guess my argument is I think it would soften the balance a lot more, if that makes any sense, because people are kind of understanding the mechanics instead of just relying on this like hearsay that they're hearing from other people. So kind of like what you mentioned with like Firebrand and Mechanist being like overinflated on the ARC DPS charts, but like if you get that natural exposure to like, hey, I could do this stun break, I had this healing, I had this utility, like early on, I think just people would begin to value it a lot more.
Yeah. It is tricky, simply because of how group-oriented the game really is. You know, I think that is something that Guild Wars 2 really does define itself as in a very unusual way, right? You know, a lot of other MMOs, they're obviously group-oriented. You know, you have healers and tanks and so on. But correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think in other games your damage can go up, double, even triple, right? Because of other players giving you buffs. I don't think that happens in other games. That is quite unusual. And this is even true of your survivability. Obviously, in a traditional MMO, having a healer is going to do wonders for not being dead, obviously. But in Guild Wars 2, the supports are insane. They are so strong on how much more durable you can be. I mean, look, you can have a buff in this game that just flat out gives you 33% damage reduction all the time, permanently, right? That is insane if you think about it. I think one time I was looking at abilities in World of Warcraft because I kind of follow that game a little bit with the world's first race and stuff like that. And I was watching these teams coordinate an ability. I believe it's called Power Word Barrier or something like that. And I believe it was something like 20% damage reduction for 10 seconds. It's also capped on how much damage it can absorb, and it has like a 2-minute cooldown. And we have 33%, no condition, and it's permanent. Wow.
And you could apply barrier, which saps up all the damage anyway.
Yeah. That is pretty good. That's very, very strong. And I think it's quite easy to miss just how strong a lot of these group utilities are. We've completely derailed here. And you know what? I like that. But just, you know, interesting little side point about the balance and design of the game, I guess.
Do you wanna go like to, because I have the philosophy, the balance philosophy stream notes, I guess, open right now. And we could go over like what they define as the roles in PvE, what they define the roles in as in world versus world and player versus player, and whether or not we agree with what they say the roles are.
I mean, we can. I think the way they talked about roles was very interesting. You know, in PvE, this one is an interesting one. Because they said damage dealer, offensive support, boon support basically, and then healer.
and then healing.
And
but that's not how it usually is.
yeah, that fascinates me because the implication there is that they want pure healers to exist, which is interesting, which is very interesting because there aren't that many of those in the game. In fact, the only, the really major one, I guess, would be Heal Scourge, right? That's the one that you'd think of immediately.
Yeah, but they also say defensive boons, the healing through defensive boons and raw healing.
Yeah. But I think typically supports don't only provide Aegis and like stability and healing. Usually, I mean, Firebrand is like the obvious examples. Like it provides all of those things and quickness. So
quickness, and then the other one provides all those things and alacrity.
Yeah.
And that's how it always is. And so it's interesting that there's this role, boon support, which I assume they mean to do the key offensive boons, alacrity and quickness, but it's not a healer.
Yeah. I find it really interesting because we could have seen Yorusu move in a very different direction, because right now we kind of have the split between like quickness, which is attack speed, and then alacrity, which is cooldown reduction. And then you have some supports that provide one, and then some supports that provide the other. The other, like, imagine if we rewinded like 2 years from now and then they were like kind of doing all this stuff. You could have had one support that provided quickness and alacrity, and then another support that was pure healing, right? That was kind of like what it was back in the day with the Chrono Druid meta. But they chose to split it this way instead. I don't know exactly why they have the design choices, but I would actually, kind of thinking about it, it actually makes organizing groups a lot harder, because otherwise you could just look for DPS, healer, and then boon support, right?
I think it's because that then you will have the situation you have currently with Mechanist and Firebrand, but like basically the same thing again, but with the healer that everybody loves and the boon support that everybody loves.
Yeah.
I think we would run into the same problems. I just find it interesting that that's where they wanted to make the split, right? Otherwise, like you could say like offensive supports, like someone's bringing up like Might and Fury. I think that qualifies, right? Like you could have one offensive support that gives quickness, alacrity, Might, and like what was it, like Fury, all of that kind of stuff. And then you could have a defensive support that brings healing, protection, Aegis, regeneration, stability, that sort of thing. So I don't know. I just thought that was a bit interesting.
Someone in chat asked, why is Might and Ferocity not seen as key offensive boons? I mean, they are, but they're not the alacrity and quickness key offensive boons. But I think it's also that they're so easy to come by that they're not like considered the key ones.
Yeah, Might and Fury will typically get bundled in with quickness or alacrity a lot of the time. And Might now is just on a bunch of weapon skills, right? So you just have Might overflowing. Same with Fury, I guess, too, actually. A lot of traits just throw Fury at you these days. Yeah, I think that perhaps they were just acknowledging the fact that you could run double offensive support and a healer. Pretty unlikely to see that pop up because, again, this is something that ArenaNet do, in fact, by even talking about roles, they're kind of acknowledging this, right, is that players are going to want to streamline building a group as much as possible, right? So if you can get role compression down to, okay, we only need to search for 2 things on the LFG instead of 4, they're obviously going to go for the 2 because, look, I'm sure everyone here, well, actually, you know what? Maybe some of the young whippersnappers in the chat won't remember this. When you would have to wait in a raid for double Chrono, double Warrior, double Druid. That is pain and suffering, my friends, okay? 6 unique roles for every single raid group, pretty much. Not a good time, okay? If you're in the LFG, that's going to take a while sometimes. So I think that having a huge amount of unique things that you need to collect to build your group, that's not desirable, but it is, of course, a possibility. If you want to go for like a healer, double offensive support, I think that's completely fine, right? And that's legitimate. You can even right now, you can absolutely slap a heal Scourge into your group. You could run like a quickness Firebrand, an alacrity power mech, or an alacrity Spectre or something like that, and then boom, all of a sudden you get your heal Scourge in there, and that group comp will work just fine. But it is really interesting to see just how prevalent this really is, by the way, because I think we've seen this twice before. Like heal Scourge doesn't see much play right now, and that's primarily because it's quite difficult to fit into a group, and that's just one extra role. Just doing this even once is really hard to actually do, and players don't do it. And it was actually true back in the day as well, like the old kind of Firebrand composition. It was a little bit harder to fit a heal Scourge into that compared to the double Chrono composition, even though the double Chrono with the heal Scourge was probably a bit higher win rate overall, especially if you're playing a Tempest as well. But no, that's another little bit of a mini tangent. But yeah, player behavior is really important to note here, especially from the balance perspective of Arena. Arena really need to think about this because, again, players are going to behave in a way that makes things as convenient and as smooth and as streamlined as possible when it comes to building a group.
Right. So finding 2 roles is always easier than finding 3.
Yeah.
And actually, this whole situation is one of the things I actually took notes on. So heal and offensive boon support is mentioned in the status quo due to gearing. So I think this is somewhat due to gear stats combinations that we have, because I think you need more options for concentration on
more precision baked into power builds. So specifically, so you don't get punished as much for having Diviner Gear because you lose a lot of crit chance, which is brutal for power builds a lot of the time. Aside of something like Renegade that has like a 33% crazy crit modifier, for example. So I think that could be really good. But here's the really big one, actually. We need runes that support these builds. A huge thing about quickness support builds is, Rune of the Firebrand exists. There is no Alacrity rune, power or Condi, by the way. It doesn't exist. And there's no Alacrity power rune either, or a quickness power rune. I think adding these options into the mix would actually really, really help, because it would allow you to run more aggressive stats for power, kind of power quickness builds and power Alacrity builds. But I think it also just makes the gearing a lot easier and a lot more streamlined, and the boon durations a lot more equivalent. Because, for example, right now, I think to give Alacrity on Renegade, you need something like 80%. It's actually unhinged to give Alacrity on Renegade. That's actually very, very sad. So I think adding some rune choices in, kind of throwing those into the mix there, and just changing the way precision works for power builds can really help bring that up. You'd have to be careful with that, by the way, because it turns out that builds like Power Herald could, I think, quickly become extremely dominant and incredibly powerful with that. But obviously, you'd have to do a little bit of tuning. But yeah, I think actually targeting precision and rune options can really help, actually, with improving the amount of support builds that you can play and helping players with gearing their characters.
Hey, there's 9 or so runes that we could add to the game.
That's true.
Based on the based on the names of new elite specs, perhaps.
Yeah, that's possible. I think, and it would kind of work. Rune of the Mechanist could be like a power Alacrity rune. Rune of the Spectre could be an Alacrity Condi focused rune, so you could kind of
something with barrier.
Get a bit of barrier in there as well. That could be fun. It could be very enjoyable. There's a lot of options there. You can make a rune just for Catalyst.
Yeah. Oh,
the 6 bone. The 6 bone. Yeah, minus 10% damage. It's the opposite of Scholar. It's like literally negative 10% damage is the 6 bonus on Rune of the Catalyst.
Willbender rune does something every time you use a physical skill. Make people use physical skills.
Yeah, I think some. Yeah,
I didn't think of runes as an option.
Yeah. I would love to see more runes thrown into the mix. It's one of the things I was a bit disappointed in Ender Dragons. Actually, I was like, oh, new runes! I'm excited. I'm hyped. Let's go, new runes. And there weren't any, or sigils. Oh, unlucky. It's unfortunate stuff.
There are kind of like the same thing I mentioned with the stats, though. I do think there are a lot of runes that kind of don't fill any niches right now. Like they just kind of like exist and they don't really do anything. So I don't know. I guess just for like clarity of the game, if they were to add more runes, I would like to see them remove some of the old ones.
I think that brings us to
just retune them. Yeah.
I think that brings us to a point that they brought up as well, which was minimizing bad choices.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were very important to when they brought that up on stream. I said, "Oh no, that's my whole thing. I love bad choices." But they then said you can make wrong choices. That's fine. So that's my jam. I make wrong choices. That's okay. But they want to minimize bad choices, which means they want to, every time there's a trait that is just terrible that nobody uses because it's not useful anywhere, they want to change it to make it actually usable somewhere. Every time, and hopefully that applies to runes and sigils as well, because that would be nice if they did that too.
Yeah, I think with gear, it's pretty hard to do that. Well, I guess no. It's just that there's always going to be a pretty optimal choice because of the way runes work, right? Usually they're just like, okay, a bunch of stats and then a pretty powerful effect. It's kind of hard to get around that. And it's like, oh, this one's really good here. You know, this one's really good on this exact build. And that can happen sometimes.
Yeah, but even such a good thing like of the Firebrand, it's fantastic, right? It's great for quickness builds. But its tier 6 effect is 1 second of burning on elite skill use.
Yeah.
What is that?
You want to juice up the 6 bonuses?
I mean, obviously it doesn't need it because it's useful. It's a useful quickness boon support thing, but I mean it's just there's a lot of those. There's a lot of those.
That is certainly true. Yeah. It's definitely important to help players again to just raise that raise the floor of effectiveness, right? For example, I was a massive fan of buffing all the core weapons. I think that was actually one of the patches that brought some of the most options and new ideas to the table for the game in a very, very long time, actually. I think stuff like that is great. Just make traits that nobody plays, just make them really good, right? Or make them at least decent. Same with utility skills. Just make the utility skills a little bit better, right? Look, I'm going to throw a bone to the Ellie mains here, actually, in PvE. I think one of Elementalist's biggest problems is that its utility skills suck. They don't do anything a lot of the time, right? Like they just kind of do damage, or I don't know, like you can turn into a rock, I guess, or something like that. You know, they're not super impressive compared to, you know, something like Stand Your Ground, which is, I think Stand Your Ground is arguably the best skill in the entire game, actually. It is a pretty insane ability. And it's rather powerful. So I think stuff like that is really, really good. And minimizing the ability for a player to pick an ability that does literally nothing and is totally useless is absolutely a very good idea.
Agreed. I've been meaning for a while, and I haven't gotten around to it, but I've been meaning for a while to, you know, have you ever seen those like graphs that people put, you know, like hockey teams, for example, on a graph that's like it's with two axes, and it goes from good to bad, or bad to good, and like boring to fun.
Yeah.
And I want to put all skills and traits on a graph like that. It says like, you know, this one is not good, but it's fun, or etc. And I think then I'll send that to ArenaNet, and they'll look at it and be like, I'm throwing this in the garbage, but I get your idea. We should balance it based on fun and good. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, skills should definitely be fun to use. I think that's a big problem that also does skew balance a lot. I think a lot more two things. I think a lot more players would have played Spectre when it was incredibly strong last patch if, one, spamming wells off cooldown didn't exist. That's not very fun to engage with, even though it is very powerful. And two, rich list gear wasn't pure suffering to actually obtain, right? I think there have been some incredibly unusual choices, and this is a weird thing to bring up during balance, but it absolutely does, especially considering that, again, ArenaNet, in my opinion, have taken a very grounded and down-to-earth view of balance with the way they're looking at things. They're very much looking at balance intersecting with players interacting with the game mechanics in this, which I think is really important. I'm very happy that they're doing this, but they've got to think about this stuff, right? If players find it really annoying to get one type of gear, then yeah, people aren't going to play that build nearly as much. I think this goes into fractals as well. I brought this up a few times. I'm hitting it again, right? Fractals. If a build is insane in fractals, realistically, it's actually going to spill out into the raid and strike meta. Why? Because you gear a character and you have to invest in that character and put agony resistance on that character. And that kind of has a bit of a sticky effect on making players want to actually try other builds, because then they have to get agony resistance all over again. They've got to get ascended gear all over again, right? And it's annoying to actually do that. These are some really important things that I think ArenaNet need to think about when it comes to trying to elicit change in the way that players actually play stuff. You can go, oh, Spectre is really, really powerful and it's amazing. It does loads of damage and does a bazillion barrier every 10 seconds, which was true. But if it's really annoying to gear and it's kind of unfun to play, then nobody's going to play it.
Actually completely agree. It was something I mentioned back when I remember I was talking a little bit with my community about when Chrono Druid meta shifted into Firebrand Renegade meta. There was a bit of, we called it inertia, right? Because at that point, like Fire Brigade already existed, but nobody really played it all that much, even though people kind of knew that it was kind of strong. It's literally just because you have to completely create a new character, get it to level 80, assuming you don't have Tomes of Knowledge. You have to get all of the elite specializations again, so you probably have to run a few hero point trains through all of the different content. Then you actually have to learn the skills, probably like, spend some time in the Golem room, get it geared. Like you said, the Agony Resistance, all of this kind of like creates this inertia to actually pushing a build into like viability. And I think we see the same thing. I would actually argue this is kind of the downside of frequent balance patches, is that for Guild Wars 2, which has a relatively casual player base, right? It's like, you have a lot of people that have full-time jobs, have kids, that sort of thing. They don't have the same time to invest that like, maybe a college student who plays video games during class might have. So I think that that's also something to keep in mind. And it's why I think like small incremental changes are really, really helpful. Whereas like big overarching sweeping changes should be like, kind of just delayed a little bit to account for that inertia.
Yeah, but I mean, that's why they also say they want to have at least one very viable, usable build for each profession, so that you don't have to change every time there's a balance patch, essentially.
Yeah. And I think that there will be a goal to just kind of, if a build isn't a problem, just leave it, right? You know what I mean? I don't think it's going to be, it's time for your, it's time for your 3-monthly time to regear your entire character. I think that's very unlikely to happen. What's more likely is that they're going to attack issues and problems that they see pop up and slowly address design over the next coming balance patches. Probably, look, if anyone wants a timescale, this is going to take years to do what they want to do, by the way. So don't get too excited just yet. It's going to be years. And it's time for your dick flattening, right? No, it's not going to be that. It's going to be once it's fine and it's not causing problems, it can just be left there. Maybe they'll play around with the numbers a little bit. But after it's a well-designed, acceptable build, it can just exist, right? It can just be allowed to sit there and be happy.
Mm-hmm. World versus world. There's 2 roles in World versus world.
Yeah. I think that was probably quite a controversial statement. But I think it kind of makes sense because it's so hard to actually define. Like almost everything in World versus World is very hybrid-y. Does a little bit of everything. So
yeah. And I'll say this: the reason why they don't mention roamers in here is the same reason they don't mention solo adventurers in PvE, because those builds will always be made. It's not something trying to fit into a puzzle. It's easy to make a solo open world build. It's easy to make a roaming build. But it's important. It's not important. That is important to balance those things as it is important to balance things for group content.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. World versus World. They did actually mention a little bit of what they wanted to talk about there, and specifically they wanted to spread stability out. They want to detach Guardian from being totally mandatory in World versus World, which I think is a good thing, right? This one is a really interesting. This is a weird one. Like, is it necessarily bad that there is a really, really, where Guardian almost is a role of its own? That's an interesting question. I think it would be really cool if it was spread out, but I think, weirdly enough, the World vs. World meta is actually kind of fun to play right now. So they have to be really careful. We saw a little bit of pushback on this when they tried to nerf the stability on Guardian without compensating it elsewhere. I think that kind of, and looking at it through this lens, kind of explains why. If you remove stability and Guardian becomes weaker, it kind of makes the game mode less fun. Because you're just going to get smashed all over the place, right?
They buffed it in other roles, though. Like, they really buffed the stability mantra on Mesmer.
They did.
In World vs. World. And on paper, the Mesmer stability access is pretty damn good compared to it's comparable to Guardian in a lot of ways. It's I don't know if the meta is changing anyways though.
It's going to be a while to shift that one. I think some pretty big changes are going to be needed to really move the needle much in World versus World, because it's pretty locked in, right? And I think World versus World presents another balance problem that is weird in that you are heavily incentivized to stack the same thing, because you have so many players that a tiny advantage of, say, something being a little bit better can really add up over a group of 50 people. So you're heavily incentivized to stack incredible things, particularly seeing as that means that all of the cooldowns will align and they'll kind of synergize with themselves pretty nicely. I think it's very difficult to actually promote a lot of diversity in Zerg metas for sure. I think the goal with World versus World is more just to provide a lot of options that can work really, really well, right? You know, I imagine they want to have a build for Ranger and Thief that works really well in large-scale World versus World play. They want to add more support options. They want to make Druid, you know, like a proper healer that can actually, you know, function correctly, you know, in a World versus World Zerg, stuff like that. Spectre as well, maybe, who knows?
Can't really say that much for World vs. World, but maybe I can provide a bit of a new player perspective. So I was doing it myself for a little bit for what is the ring conflux or not? Yeah, conflux, I think. So I got into World vs. World on just like a build that I enjoy playing, which is Power Chrono at the time, and I got completely smeared on the floor as soon as I walked in, right? Because there were like roamers walking around, there were people like camping like the front gates and everything. I like once ran into like a big Zerg before I really knew how to join into them, and I fell behind almost instantly, right? So I think balance should not just be looking at like just Zerg play, but I think also like those like what do they call like roaming and stuff. I think that's also like really important because that's the first taste of World vs. World that I think new players will get into, right? Because like you don't know what you don't know. So a new player is not going to go into World vs. World thinking, oh, I'm going to join this 50-person squad that's like in Discord and organizing all of these subgroups and squads and everything. Like they're not quite at that point, right? So it's like I don't know. I just remember that.
You make a good point because I mean, what I do in World versus World is 99% of the time solo roaming, and I love it. That's like my jam. But it's hard to explain. So when you have a solo roaming build, it's not going to be the same thing you use in a Zerg fight, no matter what. You like, except for I play a solo roaming Firebrand, so it's kind of easy to transfer it to when I go and join a large group. But it really seems like they want World versus World to be more group focused for the future of the game mode rather than just the solo roaming. The solo roaming is going to happen anyway, and that's why people play solo roamers, so they could pick off new people trying to get to their Zergs. Unfortunately, it's just kind of like one of those things you have to learn, right? Like I think if someone new to World versus World who doesn't want to just join up with a large Zerg and wants to go around by themselves a little bit first, which is what's going to happen if you don't know what the game mode's all about. You have to kind of treat it a little bit like PvP and maybe have a kind of a PvP build going into it. And I wonder, I mean, yeah, basically solo roaming is just PvP, but with extreme stats.
Yeah. Celestial.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying they should like only balance around it. I was just thinking like, you know, we're thinking big 50v50v50 like Zergs and stuff and like how you can kind of like balance those. Whereas I feel like something that might help more is instead focusing on like, you know, 5v5 or 10v10 or even like, I don't know, like 15v15, like two small kids kind of chucking at each other, because then like those negatives or the positives aren't quite so amplified across 50 people. It's I guess like the effects are a bit more contained. And then, I mean, I guess
that they should start balancing the game around 15 versus 15, like
GVG?
a certain game mode that may or may not exist right now, but kind of exists, sort of. That I know someone is a big fan of, who is now currently working for ArenaNet.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything. I'm simply laying down the possibilities, you know?
Roy bringing GVG to the table, huh? Interesting. Yeah. It's definitely a good point about the roaming thing and a new player introduction. Honestly, super hard. You know, like super hard to actually deal with, because World versus World is inherently a bit of an esoteric game mode. It is arcane. The workings of it are very unusual because it's so player defined. It's so sandboxy that there's always going to be a very steep learning curve into figuring out how the builds work and how the systems work there. But yeah, trying to ease that is certainly desirable. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah. And then there's player versus player. The roles in player versus player, I mean, they pretty much cover all of them, I think. Support, obviously, team fight damage dealer, bruiser, roamer, and side noder. Are bruiser and side noder kind of the same thing?
I think the bruiser is more like something that is more focused on not 1v1s, but fights that have, you know, 2, 3, or 4 players in them. So like a little bit of team fight, but can also hold its own in a 1v1. Well, no, I mean, Catalyst is definitely more of a side noter. I would say it would. I think Bruiser would have been more like Bladesworn.
But that's also a side noter, kind of.
Kind of, but it's really amazing in the 2v2s, right, and the 3v3s and 4v4s. That was where it like really excelled. Was it? It wasn't as good as like a mega team fighter in like an Omega team fighter, but yeah. It's a little bit. It's definitely a bit of a. You're gonna have some overlap there as well, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Like Bladesworn was very often played as a duelist as well. I think it was kind of leaning a little bit more into that. It also functions pretty damn well in these slightly larger encounters too. Although Catalyst is as well. You're not wrong. I guess they both are kind of bruisery as well. Like rather than just like a pure duelist.
Yeah, I mean they don't go very much in depth in PvP of what they're planning to do for it. I think it was the stream was heavily more focused, I think, on PvE than anything else. I'm wondering, because they mention also skill splits, right?
Mm-hmm.
They mentioned that obviously they do skill splits for PvP versus world versus PvE, but they say that they may start doing more of what they did with Scrapper, which is split skills functionally between game modes. Like with Quickness Scrapper, that only exists in PvE right now instead of World vs. World and PvP. Is that something you think they say they'll try to do it limited because it gets confusing, but is that something you think is important?
I think in a perfect world, you don't split functionality ever, because yes, I think it is really confusing. I like the fact that they've said a defensive skill is always going to be defensive, so you would use the skill in the same way, right? For example, a Firebrand heal skill, right? It gives protection in PvE and it gives Aegis in competitive modes. So they're still defensive. Use it to heal yourself and bolster your ability to absorb damage in some way. That is absolutely, I get that. I see where we're coming from. However, I would like to see them actually take an approach of unification as time goes on. So I'm okay with like band-aiding it. Okay, right, we have to split this functionally for now, right? However, I would really like to see them attempt to fix that down the line and make the skills converge again. Because yes, I actually do think that skills functioning differently in different game modes is actually a big problem. It's something that is just going to increase the learning curve and make the game even more confusing and complicated than it already is. And maybe not even for your own character, by the way. I think it's actually more problematic when you're playing against other characters. Let's imagine that you play PvE, right? And you know how PvE builds work, broadly speaking, right? And you know that, Guardian heal skill is protection and resolution. And then you go into PvP, and you face a Firebrand in PvP, and you're like, where is all this Aegis coming from? What the hell is going on, right? And it's all well and good when you're playing Firebrand. You just mouse over your heal skill and go, oh, look, in PvP it does this. But how do you know that it's changed for an opponent, right? For something that you aren't playing. I think that's where it really gets problematic, because then you're going to have to go and log on to another character, look at it, or look at the wiki and then check that it works differently. This particular skill works in a different game mode. Yeah, so I think it is actually very undesirable. Oh, no. I forgot to update your Twitch. Disaster.
You did.
While you're updating that, I actually had a bit of an idea. So I was listening to their preview, and they were talking about how eventually they want every skill to be viable, right? But not viable in every single game mode. Just some are viable, like, PvP, World vs. World, PvE. Instead of having skill splits, so like having one skill that is like, does one thing in PvE and then another thing in PvP, would it be that weird to have skills that are only available in PvP? Like, I don't know. I don't know if that's like a weird idea.
I don't think that's crazy. I mean, I kept on. I continuously. I mean, first of all, in PvE, there are certain skills that are only available in PvE. The racial skills. So it's not crazy because that exists. I think that's interesting. I think that's not a bad idea.
I mean, they said it specifically. They wanted to balance skills so that they are viable in certain game modes and stuff. And I think it would also cut down on a lot of the complexity, right? It's like when you go into a PvP like arena, it completely changes your build. Like I remember that confused me for a really long time. I had to find the button to actually swap between my PvE and PvP builds and stuff.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, if they're gonna design skills specifically for PvP, why not make them only available in PvP?
I mean,
so it doesn't affect the balance in PvE.
That's something that I was considering, because I had ideas, because you know how the question remains of, in a new expansion, are they going to be able to make an entire new set of elite specializations? It'll be tough, right? Because, you know, adding that much more to the game when there's so many roles already being filled by the current elite specializations, it'll be tough to come up with new things that are inventive and good. But maybe what they could do is have skills that are earnable in game for, I guess, different game modes. So, you know how back in Guild Wars 1 you had capture skills. You could capture skills from bad guys, and they also had skills that were Luxon skills and Kurzik skills that all classes could use. Perhaps that's something they could do in the future. Skills that are capturable in game and usable by all professions.
Do you know what the version of this is? I'll tell you what the version of this is that works in the game. It might be, if you want to go this direction and say, okay, well, these skills are essentially only available in PvP or World versus World.
Yeah.
Simple. You just nuke them in the game mode where you don't want them to exist. So if we want to make a PvE only skill, but this PvE only skill would be incredibly problematic in PvP or World versus World, we nuke it from orbit in PvP and World versus World. And okay, we've essentially now created a PvE only skill. The reason for this is
minimizing bad decisions, right? It's like if the skill, you can still select it in PvP, then you're making a very, very bad decision.
Yeah. And you're basically saying you want to do what you just said was problematic and you don't want to do, which is change probably. If you're nuking it from orbit, you're changing the functionality of the skill in a different game mode.
Well, you're just making the numbers really bad on it. I mean, you could even disable it if you wanted to. But no, I would probably just go the nuclear option here and then redesign it at a later date. I mean, it's not ideal, but I actually think that layering on another system on top of this is actually worse than creating a bad choice and then redesigning it later.
Yeah, right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, maybe I didn't explain it right. I'm talking like, imagine you just have 5 physical skills on a class or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say those skills are just straight up not available in PvE anymore. Like you can't even select them. But if you go to PvP and then like maybe those are the only skills that you can use in PvP, right? And then they're balanced for the PvP game mode. That's more along the lines of what I was thinking, because they kind of hinted at it in their stream where they're like, they want all of the skills to be viable somewhere, but not everywhere. So they're kind of unofficially doing it, but they're still leaving the option on the table. There's probably some sort of like core system in place that prevents them from doing it right away. But if that's the general idea, right? It's like if they have a skill that's specifically balanced and it's really good in PvP, you probably don't want to take that in PvE. So why give players the choice to even select it in the first place? But I do think there are like systematic issues.
I think that it would be easier for them to balance, but I think it's the kind of decision that if they take a decision like that and make it feels like you're taking stuff away from players, right? Rather than adding new stuff. Like if you added new skills in PvP that are only available in PvP, that sounds like it's adding things for PvP. That's something that players would like. If you're taking away the skills that they would normally get in all game modes from certain game modes, it feels like you're taking it away from them, and that's something players wouldn't like.
Yeah. It would have to be exclusive, or I mean, actually, this is how it is in Final Fantasy, right? Like when you go into PvP, you have a totally different skill set, if I recall correctly.
That's actually where I got the idea.
Yeah, and this is a pretty interesting idea, but ultimately, I do think it isn't actually desirable. I think that the solution here isn't to add a new system to kind of band-aid it. I think the way is that you find a design that works in both game modes. They tried to do this with Scrapper, didn't work out super well the first time, but I think it is possible. I think it is possible to find a design for, say, Scrapper gyros that can make World versus World players and PvE players happy at the same time. I think it's possible to change Firebrand in such a way that it will be healthy in PvP again. Because, funnily enough, there are a few examples of things that have been nuked from orbit, specifically Firebrand and Scourge, because these in PvP, yeah, because the design, as in the mechanics of these professions, is so oppressive to PvP that I really want to put this in perspective, and this is true with Vindicator, by the way. Vindicator in PvP right now. It got nerfed by 80%, maybe more than that, and it's still really strong in PvP. This is why you
busted.
Yeah, because it was broken. Its mechanic, and that was only by adding one more dodge, by the way. That's what broke it.
I know, but
right?
that's like saying, yeah, I'll add one more dodge to Firebrand, then it's going to be pretty good too in PvP.
Yeah, this is, honestly, I think if you added an extra dodge to Firebrand, it still wouldn't be good, actually.
3 dodges on Firebrand?
No, I actually don't think that would be enough.
I don't know.
I think it's the dodge combined with the fact
the fact that certain mechanics are tied
it has a lot of mechanics
yeah.
attached to it. There's a lot of baggage there that makes that really, really good. It would be a big buff, obviously, because
dodge
rolls are pretty good.
Heal on dodge.
That's true. That would be value. That would be value. That is true. But I think this might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, actually, considering that it almost is a bit weird to say this in a game that is so, most of the player base is PvE. But in my opinion, if you want PvP to be a well-designed game mode, you have to design abilities around PvP and then make them work in PvE. So you have to be PvP-centric with your design. If you don't, PvE will annihilate PvP, which is exactly what's happened in Guild Wars 2, by the way. I'm not just making that up or saying that. That's exactly what's happened. Almost every set of elite specializations has butchered PvP because all of the elite specializations have not been designed with PvP in mind at all, right?
That's Spectre.
That's Spectre, that's Mirage, that's Daredevil, by the way. 100% that's Daredevil, right? That's Firebrand, that's Scourge. Honestly, Chronomancer as well, right? All of these things are just busted, right? From a PvP perspective, and are almost impossible to actually manage. So I think if ArenaNet need to kind of think about these game modes a little bit if they want to truly balance PvP and world versus world.
Spellbreaker, I think, was kind of designed for PvP in mind.
True. That is true.
And for the longest time, people were sad that it wasn't very usable in PvE.
Yeah.
But I think there's some pretty good Spellbreaker builds out there for PvE right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Wait. It went from disagreeing. No. I was disagreeing with the idea of making skills like a unique skill for each game mode. That is something that I'm not a huge fan of, but I do think that you have to be careful with designing the skill overall. That's what you need to do. It's not that I prefer things to be unified for simplicity rather than adding an additional layer on and saying, okay, well, you can only use this skill in PvE. It doesn't exist in PvP or world versus world, right? I think it's much better to have a unified approach where a design exists that works for everything. And I think that the validity of this approach is actually seen in the example that Boots just brought up there with Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker, again, was a PvP spec for the longest amount of time, was very, very strong in PvP. But now, because its numbers have been tuned up and some adjustments have been made to Core Warrior with banners and so on and some of the core weapons, now Spellbreaker is actually an excellent option for PvE.
It just has to get good in PvP again.
Yeah. Well, it's actually it's decent. There are a few good builds, like Defense Spellbreaker is actually performing quite well in PvP right now, actually. As it turns out, Great Sword Hammer. It's a bit of a monster, actually, with a new defense trait line. Yeah. So yeah, there's actually some pretty solid builds out there for Spellbreaker, actually. Particularly seeing as it does work quite nicely into Catalyst, which is obviously one of the builds that's pretty popular right now. So yeah, there you go. There you have it.
I don't PvP at all, so just remove the game mode for me. I don't.
Yeah, I like that.
No.
That's.
I mean, there you go. That's how you do it. Instead of removing skills from certain,
remove the game mode.
Remove the game mode.
Nuke the game mode. Why nuke the skills when you can nuke the game mode? No,
exactly.
I'm like saying it in jest. I think there's a pretty decent. There's a pretty decent, I think, community in PvP now. I know quite a few people within my own community that started playing it more because they did it for the Decade achievements, and they're like actually enjoying it now, so they've been playing it more. So, yep.
Yeah.
So there's another point here they have called power budget, and it's a design philosophy. I think they're trying to introduce starting now, because I don't know if they were really following it before, which is. So it's the opposite of purity of purpose. Well, actually, I wrote that. So it's basically they're saying each skill that they design or want to balance now should have a power budget, kind of like a point buy system for D&D, where if you want it to be a damage skill, you put it all into damage, or if you want it to also have CC, you take some away from the damage, put in CC, etc., etc. I don't think this was implemented until starting now, because I mean, definitely in Path of Fire, for example, just certain skills did everything. You know, this seems like something that's new, and I really want. It would be interesting to see if they actually have like a design system in place to implement it.
Yeah. This is probably the part of the philosophy that is going to be the most scrutinized, because this is a bit of an issue with the game right now. And in fact, this is probably the biggest balance problem, certainly in PvE, is that certain abilities are just insanely overloaded, and rather certain kits are incredibly overloaded. For example, the classic example, we'll just do mech again. Power Mechanist isn't overloaded, but isn't overpowered because it does 35k DPS or whatever. Even when it was at its maximum, it was like 37k DPS. That wasn't why it was overpowered. There's nothing wrong with a build doing 37k DPS in the current paradigm of Guild Wars 2. There is a problem with a build being 1200 range with good sustain baked into it, really good team support, amazing utility, and really good damage, and amazing CC. All of that in one build. Now that's a really big problem. That is a serious problem to have in your, in your game. And it's the same thing with a lot of the other really, really dominant builds, is that they just do way too much and they don't pay any price for that whatsoever.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just see a lot of people like comparing like Blink, Lightning Flash, and like Shift Signet and all that kind of stuff. I do think it's worth pointing out that you can't just look at the skill itself, right? It's like you have to look at the entire like class as a whole. And I'm gonna use like Mesmer versus Mechanist here, or sorry, like Virtuoso versus Mechanist here. So you have Blink on Mesmer, where all it does is it's a long range blink that doesn't really do anything except Sunbreak, right? And then you have like Shift Signet, where it copies your buffs, it's like a Sunbreak, it's long range, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. And you might think, okay, well that's not fair, right? Because Shift Signet seems way more overloaded. But then if you look at the rest of Mesmer's kit, where you have like boon removal on a high DPS skill, where you have access to invisibility or stealth, whereas like, Mechanist doesn't really have that, it kind of evens out if you look at the entire spec as a whole.
Yeah.
I
and
think
then you have a Lightning Flash on Elementalist.
Okay, well, and Ellie is. But I guess that is something also to kind of keep in mind, is like, the whole point system. I think it's not just relevant for a single skill. If you do that for every single individual skill, then if every single individual skill, let's just say, is like slightly overpowered, and every skill in that like class is slightly overpowered, then the class as a whole will be way overpowered, right? Because it's going to multiply on itself. But
and
if
it's
you have
interesting.
but it's like, then if you have like the point skill for like all of the utility skills, the heal skills, the weapon skills, the like elite skills, all that kind of stuff, then one skill that might be a little bit overpowered here might have like, I don't know, elite skills that are a little bit underpowered, and then it kind of balances out that way. So that being said, I do think Mechanist is quite overpowered still, just because every single skill is a little bit overtuned. But I do think that is very important. That's why I don't think it's fair to compare like specific skills to specific skills.
Yeah, it's interesting, the power budget. Like, they'd have to apply it across everything as well, right? Because it can't just apply it to skills, because the traits of certain classes inherently give bonuses.
Exactly.
And so they would have to apply it to all traits as well, and then they'd have to apply it to just the mechanic of the class itself. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's applicable really to Guild Wars 2 in its current state.
No, it isn't. It's chaos. It's complete Wild West out there in terms of power budgeting. It's insane. Yeah, it's totally unhinged. And I think it would be really interesting if to almost like come up with a list of what would take away or give you some power budget. I think or ArenaNet thinks, actually, for example. I think that a build that only auto attacks to do damage and has all of its other weapon skills totally free and all of its utility skills free, well, that should actually take away from your power budget, because you're getting bonus versatility for not using your abilities. A build that has low health right? Or has high health, rather. Think about the other way. The other way, it makes more sense, right? If you have high health, yeah, that should take away from your power budget. That might be a little bit of a hot take, actually, because again, that's a little bit of an interesting one to think about in PvE at least. But absolutely. Although in PvE, it should be more like survivability rather than just health. There's a lot more to survivability than just health, right? For example, Guardian is very survivable, even though it has low vitality. It has high armor, it has a lot of self-healing and so on. So you have to look at it a little bit more holistically than that, but you get the idea. Like, having all of these things should take away from your power budget, and you can't squish all of that into one build. Otherwise, insanity is the road you go down. Madness.
And then finally, besides incorporating player feedback, which I guess we could talk about a little bit later, talk about play and counterplay.
Yes.
Counterplay is a fundamental piece of competitive gameplay. So this is PvP and World versus World mostly, but they're saying they want to cut down on instant skills, basically, right?
Yes. I think instant skills, certainly, this is something that I found quite frustrating in PvP, and I think a lot of PvP players find this quite frustrating, is that sometimes builds that pop up are very uninteractive. And I think stuff like Mesmer can be really unfun in this regard, especially when they kind of come out of stealth and burst you really aggressively. Kind of the same thing with Thief to an extent. Thief Steal, really fun to try and play around that one. Very enjoyable, very interactive.
Stealth in general.
Yeah, that kind of stuff definitely is a bit annoying to play around. But I think it's also really true on the supports, by the way. I would say that support Guardian in particular is very guilty of this in PvP, because a lot of your healing and support abilities are instant cast. You just hit your F2 and you heal people, right? You shout and people have boons, right?
You can have this quick dynamic gameplay because of the instant activation skills. I think what they're probably going to have to do is keep instant activation skills, but make those skills not as insanely impactful as they currently are in some cases. Because otherwise, it'll just slow down all combat in Guild Wars 2, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for the game.
No, I think it is fine to have kind of like interrupts, right? Like, something, honestly, it's really hard to balance an instant cast skill because of just how strong it is, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong. I think there's room for, say, Mesmer to have Mantra of Distraction, right? Maybe you have to nerf it, you might have to modify the range, you might have to modify the cooldown, whatever, to kind of keep it in check, to make it not be overly oppressive. You could look at Power Block as well, for example, to make sure that combo isn't too crazy. I think there's room for abilities like this, but you just have to be very, very careful because, this has definitely been true of Mesmer more than most other professions, I think, in PvP, is that when Mesmer is super, super strong, it can be unbelievably unfun to play against, especially if you're a new player and you don't know how to approach it, right? And how to abuse the game mechanics. I mean, it is fun. It is fun when you're just like,
My first foray into making bad builds was when I finally figured out how to make an elementalist one-shot somebody with all the different instacast skills. And then, also with the coming out of stealth engineer, killing somebody in World versus World. But it's not good for the game, but it's so fun. I don't know what else to say.
I think they emphasize more like instance cast skills. They didn't want that to be like offensive in nature, right? Like I got kind of like exactly against what you're saying. It's like they don't want you to be able to just one shot someone like in like half a second. I think instant cast skills defensively in general are a little bit more balanced because you only get utility out of defensive skills if somebody's attacking you, right? It's like if I like press stand your ground in the middle of nowhere, did I actually press stand your ground sort of thing, right? It's like if I have stability but nothing's trying to knock me down, what uses the stability, right? So at least from my perspective as someone who doesn't really play that much PvP, I think having a fast reaction, like instant cast defensive skill, if you're able to like watch someone's animation and say like, oh, they're about to do a really big attack, I should probably do something to like defend myself with it, and you make that split second decision, I think that should be okay. But I think the other way around is a little bit less fun because if you can't do anything to control it.
Yeah, you're probably right. But another important thing though, for the defensive instant cast things, they can't be skills that give you benefit even if you're not attacked. They can't be
Oh,
insta-cast,
yeah.
just
I
spam it
mean,
off cooldown kind of situation,
yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think there's obviously like the extreme on the other end as well. I just
Mm,
think the lesser of the two evils is to have defensive skills be instant cast than offensive skills.
mm.
So
I think there actually is something to be said, not necessarily about instant cast, but actually about counterplay in PvE as well. And I kind of want your guys' opinion on this, because maybe I'm just insane, but I actually feel that over time, Guild Wars 2 has actually become a lot less reactive and a lot more passive in PvE. And I think that isn't good. I think that's less fun, but I think it also really makes a lot of builds a lot more brittle. The words merging together there. You end up with very brittle builds that kind of can't respond very well to what's going on. And I actually think that this is a really big problem on why certain builds, especially DPS builds, feel incredibly weak compared to other more reactive, more versatile builds that kind of pop up in the meta. Again, Elemental is going to rear its head there. You just can't respond to what's going on. So I actually think that this philosophy of making your build react kind of the other side of counterplay, being able to respond to something, I think that's actually a really important philosophy to apply in PvE too, because I think it makes the game more fun, more skillful, and it also makes it allows you to make certain builds a lot more powerful.
Do you think then, okay, so the things you could do for counterplay in PvE are preemptively popping Aegis or Invulns, or afterwards doing a lot of healing. And I think, or just avoiding it by dodging or walking around certain things. So I think obviously everybody should be able to dodge or walk around certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that because certain classes have so much access to Aegis and or Invuln, is that a problem for PvE? Do you think Aegis and Invuln should be taken away or given to everybody in some fashion?
it'd be really interesting if bosses were a bit more dynamic. I think I guess it's like having access to these skills that make defensive play like really, really powerful. I think that's okay. I think the issue you see it a lot in like the older like raids and stuff where they were designed for, I guess, a less power creeped state, so to speak. You can kind of like use your skills and then 5 seconds later then you like reap the benefits without actually having to like react in the moment. Whereas I feel like I see this a lot, especially in, I think, Anka CM, or what's it called, Zoonlight Jade Junkyard CM. I think that is one of the most reactive fights that you actually have to play around, and it's actually not that scripted. And I think that's actually why a lot of people have issues with getting GITV, because you have to do near perfect amounts of damage while also reacting on the fly. And I think in those cases, like those defensive skills are a lot less potent because you only get value out of them if you use them at the correct time. So personally, I would love to see ArenaNet do more of those types of content. That way it's like, I don't know, for me personally, I find it fun, right? It's just like you're not just doing the same fight every single time. You can do it literally with your eyes closed if you like know the timers and everything. But like, I don't know, that kind of react in a way, kind of like bringing PvP to PvE.
Yes.
So
yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in terms of balancing stuff, I would kind of I'll sit on the fence there with this one, Boost. What I would say is I think that the really, really strong builds have a little bit too much. For example, is it healthy for Virtuoso to have Blade Turn Requiem and also having Distortion?
yes.
Okay,
What are you
that's
trying to
probably
do to me?
that's probably
What
a
are you
little
trying to
much.
do?
Okay, it's
As a
maybe
matter
a
of fact, I
little
think
too.
it should.
Maybe a little too much. Is it okay that Firebrand has, well, Firebrand's Aegis got toned down, but should Firebrand have as much stability as it has on such a low cooldown? Yeah, okay, that's probably a bit too much, right? But I think there's a middle ground there. There's room where you can bring builds that have basically nothing up and bring some of the really, really top ones down a little bit, so it doesn't just get like, oh, you're so powerful and so reactive that the boss can't do anything, right? Like the boss can't possibly defeat you, right? That's no fun either, right? If the boss can't win. So yeah, there's something to be said there. And in terms of like the way I would do it, this might actually be controversial, but I think that at least certain rotations, maybe not every rotation, but at least some rotations need to have sequences where you aren't mashing every single one of your abilities off cooldown. You need to be able to use some of your abilities reactively. I think there's a big trend right now in PvE where you use all of your buttons to do damage, including your utility skills sometimes. So
that's because you need to use all your utility skills all the time to get the boon uptime that you
yeah.
need.
But that, to me, that's a huge issue because it means that certain builds are inherently limited with how reactive you can be because you're mashing all your buttons off cooldown. And if you don't, you get punished. You know, if you don't mash all your skills, well, then you either lose a shit ton of damage or you lose boons. And then your team's going to flame you, right? Because they're like, where's my alacrity? Hand it over.
I'll
right?
tell you this. I watched your video, the first 5 minutes of it.
Yep.
And and I'll tell you this. You brought up Spectre as the most egregious version of it, that you have to do all your things, and then you don't have the uptime of the healing anymore because you have to use your heal skill off cooldown in order to get the alacrity. That's not true. That's not true. The heal skill is only 13% of your healing on a heal Spectre.
Well, yeah, but if you're not a heal Spectre, if you're, say, a damage Spectre, then that's a big
then
chunk
why
of
do you?
healing.
Yeah. Then you're
because
also
have you seen the base value on that heal?
It's pretty good.
It's like 5k base. That's damn good.
Pretty good.
That's like wash the pain away, but
Yeah.
Spectre on a 20-second cooldown.
Yeah.
It's very strong.
Very strong.
Yeah, it's so sad on Herald, actually. I like that Herald uses its stun break and its heal skill in its rotation.
Yeah.
That's so painful. Oh my god. Why? I think that it's really good when you... Yeah.
And even though it's part of a rotation, it's still... I can't play Tempest, Alacrity Tempest, just because even with quickness, the overloads are way too slow for me. I just can't take it. I can't.
Oh. It's big. Even with quickness, it's not enough.
Even with quickness, it's not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The scrapper one. That is actually illegal. Function gyro as part of the rotation. What are we doing, man? What are we doing? Are you serious?
That's true. That's true. Heal
ridiculous.
Spectre too, actually, because Heal Spectre you do the steal to give boons, but the steal also
revives.
People.
Yeah.
I mean, if the traits that gave you boons when you steal also applied when you stealed off of allies rather than enemies, it would be okay.
Yeah.
Because the cooldown's lower on that, at least. But no, it's not.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah.
Question is then how would you fix that? Right? It's like realistically, even if it is a problem, how would you go about fixing that? Do you just increase
design overhaul?
Not all skills should be DPS increases. Not all skills should be worth using for damage.
They would have to put the important they would have to put the important boons on something that's part of a rotation normally, not utility skills, essentially.
Yeah.
Or profession mechanics, or trait interactions. You can put it on a trait interaction, you can put it on a profession mechanic. This is a super boring example, but Rev, right? F4. Done. And yeah, that's not super interesting. I'm aware of that, but you get the idea. Right, it's just
the
there. It
problem is that it is a complete overhaul of like the entire skill system. People would have to completely relearn their classes if you suddenly said like, let's say like Mantra of Potence on like Firebrand no longer gives quickness, right? If you move that into like, let's say like your F1 tome skills, you would have to completely relearn that system.
Remember powerful synergy on Warrior?
Double combos.
It was my favorite thing in the world. It was never used, but I loved it. And it got removed. Something like that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if they added it. Like if you do a combo finisher, you give alacrity.
Yeah.
On an internal cooldown or something like that.
Yeah, sure. I weirdly enough, I don't hate the tactics trait line for this reason because the mechanic, the quickness, right, is attached to Warrior's focus, right? I don't hate that. I don't. I think putting on core is a little bit spooky, right? Because that's, then you end up with some weird stuff where every warrior elite spec can give quickness now. That's a little scary. Same thing with Ranger. But yeah, I don't have a problem with that. That's not a bad implementation, in my opinion. And funny enough, to kind of like do the Mantra Opponents meme, I actually think Mantra Opponents is fine. It's not super interesting, but it's one skill, right? It's one skill. And yeah, to respond to that, you have to relearn it. You know what? I think that's a price that we kind of have to pay here because I think that this is a very major pain point that significantly holds back balance, actually. I think it is almost impossible to have a balanced game where certain classes break the rules and other classes have to play to bullshit rules. Like, Firebrand doesn't have to use all of its utility skills, but Scrapper does, and so does Herald. That is such an inherent unfairness on a mechanical level that is almost impossible to overcome. So I completely get you when you say that it's going to be a relearning and it's going to be a redesign. I'm totally with you, and yeah, that is a downside. However, I think it's necessary because
and
otherwise,
it goes against the current design for these things. Technically, goes against one of their core philosophies that they're talking about, which is having an easy, viable build for everybody, and then mastery gives you utility. If the easy, viable build should be the one that gives you the boons at an easy enough way to do without using all your utility skills, probably, and then mastery would give you utility.
I was more thinking, I think small reworks are definitely necessary. I mean, they've done this historically in the past, right? Like skills have changed, like how they function over time. I was thinking, wouldn't a simpler implementation just be to concentrate whatever the goal is on a specific skill? Like, let's say, like, for example, let's use Mentor of Potence as an example again, right? Like right now, I don't know the exact number. Let's say it gives 5 seconds quickness. What if the base amount was 10 seconds, right? And then they removed quickness from other sources. That way they're concentrating all of the support onto one skill. So you mash that one skill over and over again. But then on a different skill, you now, since you don't have to keep on mashing, let's say like your heal skill, now you can be more flexible with your heal skill. I guess that's more along the lines of a more subtle change that I think would require less complete relearning. And instead it's every skill, it's kind of like they said, it's like purity of purpose. Now you know exactly. Mentor of Potence is used to keep up 100% quickness. Sort of like
I think the reason why they spread out the way you gain quickness in certain builds is because basically all you would have to do then is take that one utility skill, and every build you play gives you quickness, right? And it's no longer a choice between quickness and not quickness building differently. It's always, all I have to do is take this one skill, and now everybody has quickness.
Yeah, I guess, but then it's like, then I'm going to use Firebrand as an example again, right? It's like, then you can choose to take Sanctuary or something like that for additional CC, which I mean, they already do. So this is probably not the best example. But like, but like the point kind of still stands, right? It's like, let's say like, let's look at a different, like, let's say like, I don't know, Mesmer, right? It's like when you give quickness on like seize the moment and like you shatter everything, you can use all of your other skills for like CC or portals or blinks or everything. So for example, I would actually like say like, you know, seize the moment Chronomancer is kind of along the lines of what you guys are saying. You kind of like have all of the buffs and everything functionally concentrated on some skills, and then the rest are like somewhere else. I guess like just, I don't know. I guess it's like you don't need to like completely rework skills. I think you just have to shuffle around the concentration of like buffs and damage across existing skills.
Yeah, that's
like if for example the one of the Spectre wells gave more alacrity because it also gives alacrity on top of the alacriry from the trait, then you don't have to take one extra well and you could do more utility skills.
Yeah, exactly. I find that to be a much more realistic implementation than to completely rework like classes from the ground up, because that would just be very time consuming, and I think it would also inevitably make people very upset. So
yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I think that Chronomancer is a pretty good example too, because the other thing that needs to come along with this is that if you take this boon, it's going to have a pretty significant trade-off, right? If you're a Chronomancer, you're going to have quickness or alacrity, or you're going to have Chronophantasma for a lot more damage, right? And I think that's actually something that quite a lot of elite specializations kind of break the rule on. Let's see, what is the most egregious example of this? It's probably Firebrand again, I think. If you give quickness on Firebrand, there isn't that much of a trade-off, actually, in terms of what you're actually not doing anymore. You do lose some traits that make you like a little bit sad, but you're not actually that sad. I guess you're pretty sad. Maybe Firebrand is sad enough. Yeah, I like negative 10% on Catalyst. You know, we need more of that. That's what I'm trying to get at here, guys. If you give quickness, negative 10% damage, just slap that onto those Grandmaster traits. You know, easy peasy. Although, funnily enough, you know, all jokes aside, that kind of is how it should be, but from the other direction, right? Like, it should be, if you're taking quickness, you're not taking this trait, and that's going to be, you know, it's going to take away from your power budget. That goes into the power budget thing. And to be honest, realistically, if we're talking about actually making the game balanced, it probably should be even a bigger chunk of your power budget. If you were to compute how much damage, let's say a Quickness Herald adds to the group overall, so its damage plus the DPS increase from giving Quickness and Fury, whatever, bit of might to another 4 people, or 3 people, because you probably have a healer, right? Then that's a lot of damage, okay? That's some significant DPS you got in there. You're really, you're pumping on that build. Very hard, actually.
If are we doing like lists of things we want changed right now? Because Willbender, Alack Willbender,
Yeah?
it shouldn't remove the healing, so that you could also share healing.
Willbender, the elite specialization ArenaNet forgot. It's true. Like, on a complete tangent, no one ever talks about Willbender.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
Willbender is actually a non-elite specialization. It doesn't exist. There you go. That's all I've got to say. That's it. That's,
okay, all right. That's
yeah,
fine,
that's all I've got. Yeah. It had its brief moment of brokenness in PvP, and then it was gone.
I think I can count the number of like pug Willbenders I've seen on one hand. Yeah.
It's not a lot. It was really good in fractals for like one day. People did some 100 CMs with it. That was its moment to shine, like a Condi Willbender style.
Because there's a lot of heal Alack builds out there that does some damage.
Mhm.
Willbender can do damage, sort of, and can do Alack, but they took away the heal. For what reason? What is the reason they took away the heal?
I don't know.
Okay.
Willbender is kind of one of those things that has struggled to find its identity, I think. I think it's PvP designed. I think it was designed with PvP in mind, weirdly enough.
Yeah, for sure.
And that means that, it needs
oh,
some
wait,
work
if it was designed
to-
for PvP in mind, what does the Alacrity really, really do for PvP?
Oh, no, I think that's why the Alacrity doesn't make any sense. Because I think the devs shoehorned it in at the last second. In fact, they did, right? Yes? Yeah, they did.
Okay.
Wasn't it added really late in the dev cycle? Was Alacrity, I think?
I have no idea.
Yeah, it didn't share Alacrity early on. I think that was added later, towards the end of the dev cycle, if I recall correctly. So, yeah, no, I think they just are like, okay, right, Alack, give. I feel the same about
trade-off.
I think it was the same with Spectre.
The removing healing trade-off was just because they wanted to do trade-offs on all the Grandmasters then. It wasn't for any particular balance reason. Okay, all right. Yeah.
They were like, trade-off, you're not allowed to heal. Enjoy. It's content.
Okay.
It's very, very content indeed. We'd love to see it. I think there's a few things in the game that are like that. I think Spectre, they were like, oh, fuck. We've got to make this work in PvE. Quick, Alacrity on Wells, go. And then, there you have it, right? And it was the same thing with Willbender. It's like, wait, Willbender? Quick, Alacrity F2, maybe? I don't know. I'm not sure. And then there it is. That's how we are right now. Harbinger. Let's just make it pulse AoE quickness while you're in Shroud.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That sounds very
the good
healthy.
News is that it's just not that great otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, it did, the hammer hit it in PvP. It was bonked. It got hit by the nerf bonk. So that is true. But yeah. Do we have any kind of final thoughts on the balance philosophy, the balance manifesto, as it were? I think we've kind of gone over a good chunk of topics. Let's think more or less everything we want to bring up there and cover, I think.
I do have one. I find it really, really interesting at how well the community is perceiving these like balance manifestos simply because it's CMC and Roy that is giving it.
True.
I remember thinking this because like I'm just gonna call it by name, but like when Solar first started talking on like Reddit and everything, everybody was like kind of like, oh, who is this guy? Like, why is he like suddenly talking about this? And then it kind of came very, very suddenly, right? So I think because of that, when things didn't go very well, people turned on him really, really quickly. I think the opposite can be said for like CMC and Roy. They've kind of already established a camaraderie with like the community. So I think just in general, people are a lot more willing to forgive mistakes that they might make either when they're like speaking or when they're like communicating things or later when they actually like make the changes. I guess I just find that really interesting because it shows how important like community just perception is, because like a change could be not that bad, but if it's said by someone who they deem as untrustworthy, it's going to go over a lot worse than someone who like they like. So
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I think it also helps that they have shown in the past, and especially in the case of Roy, because he was part of the community,
Mhm.
that they communicate with the community and listen to them. And they say that they're going to be incorporating player feedback, which is great. So yeah, I think that really helps too. Just trusting them to listen when we talk.
I agree. I think that's kind of like what it all boils down to, is that we as the community, we very much trust them because we have this very like humanizing like relationship with them. It's like we've seen them in action. We know that they love the game. We know that they're not doing anything like for malicious purposes. Even though I highly doubt, I don't think any dev in ArenaNet in the past has said, like, you know, like screw you in particular. I just don't want you to like have fun in the game and everything. I highly doubt they've ever actually thought that, but the community very much perceives them that way. So I guess it's just something I found very interesting. Like when I was like reading the comments, like there were some people that were like, "Oh, this is like too high level. Like they didn't actually go into anything, but it's okay. We trust you." And I was like, they would not have said that if it was anybody else like giving that talk.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, they're players themselves. I think they were very grounded in their response, very down to earth with the way they communicated. But I also think they just communicated a lot better, and it wasn't tone deaf. They're both very charismatic individuals. You love to see that, and I can never imagine either of them saying anything like Catalyst has been meta defining, right? That's like, honestly, I actually, you know what? I actually want to dig into that statement right now because I want to actually pull out the nuance here. So here's the thing. That statement was true, but it was phrased in the worst way possible. If you make the statement, Catalyst was meta defining in speedruns, everyone knows what you're talking about there. But if you say Catalyst is meta-defining in a forum post in Guild Wars 2, that does not mean the same thing, right? Because you've left it open to interpretation and people think, oh, wait, you're talking about the metagame as a whole, right? No, that's not what was being talked about that whatsoever. And that type of communication style is just not going to work. That is... You're asking for trouble there. That was a complete... That was a disaster, right? That was the worst possible way of communicating that. And, well, you know, fingers crossed that doesn't happen again. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the communication style is really important. I think, you know, the message is one thing, but the messenger is also a huge part of how that's going to be interpreted and how that's going to be received by the community. So, yeah. That's very true. I definitely will praise, Roy and CMC, and definitely Grouch too, and honestly, the developer team in general, for being great communicators. I think that over the past kind of 6 months or so, we've seen some serious improvement there, and I think that community sentiment and community morale and kind of good faith supplies, right, have increased. The stocks have gone up on how much community good faith there is towards the company, which is very important for actually having a good relationship between the developers and the community as well. We love to see it.
Thank you, ArenaNet.
Yeah, good job, ArenaNet. Someone just messaged me on Twitch, and they have said, please unban me from your channel. I am a more mature guy now than years ago. I apologize, but I just appreciate your content. Please unban me, man. What do we think? What's the verdict?
What were they banned for?
Yeah, good question.
The chat actually wants the unban. They want the freedom. Okay, that's what they desire.
I timed out somebody. Was that?
Oh, no, it wasn't that. No, I permabanned that person, actually.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. No mercy. I didn't see it the first time around. I assume it was something similar, actually. But yeah, permaban. That's how it is. But yeah, that's an unusual place to wrap up, but I think that's a good place to do it. What an excellent conversation. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for hopping on board here. Always a pleasure to discuss some interesting ideas with some of the most brilliant minds in Guild Wars 2. And it's that time where you get to, we get to talk about ourselves a little bit instead of talking about the game. So, Boots, returning.
Yeah.
Okay, returning, and we had a lot of drama, a lot of beef, literally. By the way, maybe we can get into that.
Literally
but
beef.
yeah, there's a lot of issues there, but we're back together now. And please tell us all about Heal Spectre and what's going on with that, and then the chat will give you the incorrect link to your Twitch channel.
Perfect. Heal Spectre is good. Just slap some Sanctuary runes on Heal Spectre, run Celestial Ritualist, and just spam that sword too, and you heal like an insane amount and do damage because of the Rotwall venom that you're spreading to your allies.
Boom.
Yeah, and then my channel is World of Enders on YouTube. I do bad builds, obviously. You could tell by what I just told you. And also I have a Twitch that I use once in a blue moon.
There you go. So take a look at that and get involved there. And of course, next up, it is Emmy. Return to the show. What's up with you these days? What's going on? Okay, tell us why Virtuoso shouldn't be nerfed.
Because it's the best class in the game and it should stay that way. So my name is Emmy. I do a lot of endgame PvE shenanigans. So usually things like raid trainings, fractal trainings, strike mission trainings. I actually have a Harvest Temple second progression group going on right now. And I've actually, because of them, I started opening up Mesmer office hours. That's what I've been calling them.
Oh.
So if you need any help with your rotation for any of the 3 variants, Chronomancer, Mirage, or Virtuoso, you're welcome to let me know. And I will literally hop in Discord with you, go into the Golem room with you, and then critique your gameplay. I'll even do VOD reviews. I'm going to make Mesmer again. Yeah. I pinky promise.
To get How are Virtuoso stocks? Is now the time to invest in Virtuoso, and should I make a Virtuoso build right now?
Yes.
In my very, very humble opinion, that's not biased whatsoever. I think yes.
Okay, all right.
Of course, exclamation mark host in the chat to get mostly correct links to everyone there. Of course, it'll be below in the YouTube description as well, and indeed below the stream. So you can go click on all of those things and access all this incredible content. Learn how to play Heal Spectre, learn about Sanctuary Runes, learn about Mesmer, okay? Get flamed by Emmy in voice for your putrid logs. All of these things can be yours by getting in there and finding all about that stuff. And of course, if you enjoy TeaTime, follow the stream. If you really like it, you can subscribe as well. Follow me everywhere on social media. You all know the drill at this point. Click on all the links. Have a good time. Enjoy the content. Watch all the other 300 plus TeaTimes or something ridiculous like that. Actually, it's probably not that many, but it's a lot. Okay, you can go back and see the historical progression of the show. Get in there and check them all out. And of course, thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you all next time. Follow everyone here. Subscribe, everyone. Thank you to my wonderful hosts for hopping on board to discuss a very interesting topic. And we'll see you all next time. Take it easy, gamers. See you later. Ooh.